What shall we talk about? What shall I ask you? First, I just want to hear a little bit in general about how you use TRE in your practice. Like,
Yeah.
how do you choose if a patient comes to you? What would your intuition tell you in terms of who you recommend TRE to?
Yeah. So in my practice these days, I work with people both in person and online. And maybe about half of my people are online and maybe half of the people are in person or so. And I work with a couple different modalities. Sometimes I'm doing structural integration body work. Sometimes I'm doing somatic experiencing work. Sometimes I'm doing internal family systems work. And we talk about top down and bottom up approaches. And the way my own practice has evolved, it started extremely bottom up with Bodywork. I consider structural integration bodywork to be a very bottom up approach as well, obviously, as TRE. But then as you move towards somatic experiencing, there's both bottom up and top down pieces of that, and then internal family systems. Also, there's both bottom up and top down, but it's steering in the direction of more top down kinds of approaches. It depends a little bit on why somebody is coming in. If they're coming in with a kind of a psycho-emotional question, they're trying to figure out, make a life choice, or they're trying to get clear about some almost like mental pattern or emotional pattern that they've noticed, I might start in that more top-down, more internal family systems and approach, just to, in a sense, meet them where they are. But then as we explore, I tend to broaden the lens and start to work with bottom-up approaches, because always supporting the nervous system and any neurophysiological change is what's going to be the really anchor things. And so I kind of work in those kinds of combinations. But if somebody comes in more with a bottom-up type of concern, that they're not sleeping well, or there's anxiety patterns, they don't feel as grounded as they can be, or they're responding to certain situations like relational things, they're responding from a stress physiology. Maybe they notice either a fight-flight reactivity to things, or they're always in hyperarousal, or maybe they notice that they're shut down or they're in freeze physiology. Or maybe it's more what's called syndromal, that it's more body health things that are bringing them in, things like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue or Lyme disease, the impacts of that, or mold exposure. So these are more long COVID. These should all be more health-related concerns. And because I work on that whole spectrum of both sort of physical things, but also psycho-emotional kinds of concerns, my starting point is going to depend a little bit upon that. But for almost everybody, I'm going to bring in neurogenic tremoring, and it just depends on when. If they're coming in, if they're more on the bottom-up side of things, then I will usually begin, if not the first session, sometime within the first 3 sessions, I'm going to be using neurogenic tremoring, because for a few reasons. One, I'm going to learn a lot about that person by watching them tremor. In a sense, I've at least spoken to someone. I've gotten a sense of their nervous system and their polyvagal states just through conversation and hearing about how they are in their life and their life contexts and things. But when we go through the process of stimulating the neurogenic tremor response, that's my opportunity to slow them down, notice what it's like when they go into a relaxation response, because before tremoring, I always spend time doing sort of a body scan and almost a progressive relaxation kind of an approach. And so again, I'm learning about their breath, I'm learning about how they slow down, and then of course stimulating the neurogenic tremoring. And here we can see lots of things. We can see how readily accessible is it for them. We can learn a little bit about how quickly things move in their nervous system. After a minute or two of tremoring, and let's say, for example, we pause, how much change in sensation and what did they notice? And people are as very much on a spectrum, where some people, they like it feels comfortable, but there's nothing overly significant happening. But other people, even just a little bit, and they're already beginning to notice shifts and changes in their mood, body sensation, their mental cognitive state. And so I'm learning right away how, in a sense, how responsive their system is to the
Yeah.
stimulus of neurogenic tremoring.
So you're learning while you're watching the person, as well as learning from what that person is telling you back during the tremor session, but also between tremor sessions.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So within the first tremor session, I'm learning a lot about their nervous system, how responsive they are, right? And because my style when I'm working one-on-one is we do a little bit of the tremor response, we pause, we evaluate any changes in sensation, interoception, does their body temperature change, does their mood or affect start to shift, do any associations come up? And so we're gathering information in that initial session of how responsive they're. And I'm looking for things like, I'm also learning what their predominant stress physiology is, or at least what the tremor response is directing them to. For some people, they start to tremor and they're going into they're moving up the polyvagal curve or moving into more of an arousal state. They get bigger movements perhaps, stronger movements, increase in temperature, maybe their heart rate goes up, and maybe they may even report things like that they're thinking about either it feels like I'm running or something like that. So you could go into higher states from a polyvagal perspective, or you might go into more freeze physiology. I recently had a really interesting, actually several examples all within the same few weeks, where as we introduced the tremor response, people were what was really happening was they're slowing down, they're noticing sensation, and for several people, they're going into associations of medical trauma where they remember coming out of surgeries, the scene of being in the operating room is there. Very often there's a body sensation connected to coming out of anesthesia, often a numb quality or almost like a frozen layer within the body. And so that's a very common thing in neurogenic tremoring, is to move from the freeze immobilization pattern back into, so that's coming down from the very top of the polyvagal curve, which is the freeze immobilization branch of the nervous system. So again, by spending that first time tremoring with someone or the first few times, I'm just simply learning about where on the polyvagal curve are they using tremoring to regulate from? Yeah. And so that's at assessing the nervous system perspective. Now, but I also get a lot of mechanical information because I'm seeing what moves freely. I'm looking at what's happening in the spinal column, the connection to the head, the neck, the eyes, the shoulder girdle. So looking for what degree of interconnectivity is there between musculoskeletally and myofascially, or are there areas of rigidity or where there isn't movement or blockages, we might say? And similarly, what's the relationship of breath? Does breath restricted to one zone of the thorax, or is there three-dimensional movement, top, bottom, front, back? So I'm watching for that too, and how it's changing. And then, of course, I'm getting the feedback from how did the session land for the person, not only while we were together, but following that evening, how did they sleep? How do they feel the next day? And we're using that information to guide the process. But my favorite thing is that when we introduce neurogenic tremoring within the overall flow of somebody's treatment, that we begin a process of their nervous system starting to self-regulate. We'll do it together for as long as we need to, but then they start to do it independently. And we might still do tremoring in some of our sessions, but I'm often freed up to that they're doing the really significant bottom-up work on their own mostly, or maybe they're joining the group classes that we have online as a way to continue that process. And then now my one-on-one work with them can be a little bit more specific. Again, connecting more at the top-down level, or connecting into from a perspective of parts from the IFS framework, or looking at situations of stressors and from a somatic experiencing perspective. So a lot of times I'll do the TRE part early on, and let that start to snowball into doing a lot of the re-regulation as it's intended to do. And then usually a lot of people are noticing all kinds of changes in how they show up in the world. They're noticing changes in their physical sensation, their sleep. They're noticing changes in how they relate to their family members, their partners, their spouses, their work environments. Many times it's kicked off in a sense, an expanding or an opening experience where somebody is experiencing themselves in a new way. And so in some ways, my work is to help them grow that portion of things. What meaning gets created as they start to, now that their nervous system is shifting gears, what does that mean for the unfolding process in their life? So that's a lot of my work, more on the somatic coaching side of things, is where are they going with this? It has a big factor.
Really cool. I can very much relate because, of course, using it both as a almost like a diagnostic tool in terms of how you approach your body and also in terms of how you approach that mind, because you can read so much about where on the curve they are at the moment anyway. Very cool. Very cool. So if you are looking at, I don't know, do you get lots of like pain patients?
Yeah, I get a fair amount of pain patients. Not as many currently, but certainly that has been a big focus in the past. With pain patients, what I mostly notice is that a lot of times the pain patients that I see are coming in with sort of chronic pain like fibromyalgia or things like that, or complex regional pain syndrome or this and that. And they've usually been a lot of different places and tried a lot of approaches. A lot of people come to me who have done brain retraining through some of the various programs like Primal Trust, Gupta. These are things that help people start to shift their limbic system around chronic pain situations and chronic illnesses. And so a lot of people, I'm connected to a few of those communities, and a lot of my current pain patients are coming through those channels. So they've learned a little bit about the nervous system, which is great, and they have maybe done a little bit of TRE or neurogenic tremoring. But it's hard to calibrate it because the challenging thing with fibromyalgia, as an example, is it's a funny thing where if you just go a little bit too much, spend a little bit too much time in neurogenic tremoring, it's like it can set you back. So the person can go more into a flare-up, and then it takes a few days to come back to baseline. Actually, at first it was challenging, but I've come to really enjoy working with those situations because it's the art of introducing safety physiology at a pace that the person can integrate. And I've learned that sometimes that pace is pretty small, like working with only a minute or two. And then this is where I then lean into sort of I work with neurogenic tremoring in combination with somatic experiencing, because in somatic experiencing, we're not on the floor, or usually not. You could be, but I often will start a session sitting up, and I teach just basic regulation, things about grounding into the chair and the floor, identifying what's called a resource or positive zones of the body, because chronic pain patients, they're very used to noticing the things that are uncomfortable. They're good at that.
Yeah.
So something that I can really use, some of the strategies from somatic experiencing, is expanding their awareness into areas that are okay, and then shifting that balance of awareness a little bit. But then we also work with other regulation strategies, working with breath, not in a patterned way like in soma breath or other things, but usually only a few breaths. We're looking for the right kind of breath that in the language I always use is, what's the kind of breath that your body would appreciate right now? Not like trying to shift the whole physiological state with 5 minutes of 4-4 breathing or something, but something more simple, usually working with only 3 to 5 breaths. And oftentimes it's with a sigh, like the physiological sigh that Andrew Huberman talks about, but just a nice full breath in, a releasing type of an exhalation. And then we do tracking. Tracking means we've done a breath or two, and then it's like riding a wave. It's like we did something, and then we notice, how did the body receive that? Did it like it? If so, then we follow that sensation of, yes, I liked it. And then we just keep watching and we look for other changes that start to happen. So I think of it as like you ride a little wave. That's the stimulus. Maybe it's a breath, or I'll give you another example here in a second. And then instead of getting off the wave right away to do something else, it's like we really just follow it and follow it. And even when there's not much going on, we still follow it. That's the art of tracking. And the amazing thing is that when we really start to track at that subtle, when we start to track at that subtle level, this has something to do with what we pay attention to continues to change physiological state. If we follow that along, a lot can, it's if we don't get off the wave too early, then we can go further with it and get deeper changes at the autonomic nervous system. So I teach those skills of subtle, one of my SE teachers said that SE is sneaky powerful, and I like that phrase.
Yeah, that is very nice.
Because it seems so subtle, but
Yeah.
that's actually where the power comes in.
Yeah.
And so a lot of, again, if a pain patient can only work with a few minutes of tremoring, that's fine on the tremoring side, but there's a lot we can do on relaxation, working with breath as I'm describing, tracking. In somatic experiencing, we work a lot with the eye gaze, and again, looking for resource, using our visual environment to stay connected to the outside world, and looking for things that, noticing things in our outer environment that are regulating. Like for me right now, as I take a moment and I scan through what I can see right now. So I've got like a bright light on my right. That's not such a positive nervous system effect. But if I look further this way, I can see the blue sky, I can see a green tree. Over here on my left is like a nice color on the wall. And so if I take some time and I do a little bit of visual orienting, I'm noticing those things that are a little bit pleasing on my eyes. And if I pause or linger there, and if you're tuning in, you'll notice it's subtle, but subtle is powerful. You'll notice that physiological state starts to shift. So I can show people with somatic experiencing that they can start to become exquisitely sensitive to the changes of sensation, and that by becoming exquisitely sensitive, they can actually shift their state quite a bit. And so now, in a way, then we're working with two things. We're working with nervous system regulation through those strategies, and then using increments of neurogenic tremoring to really create shifts in a stronger shift to the nervous system, and then making sure that it's not too much, that it's digestible. And then what we're doing over time is we're expanding the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance might be very narrow for a chronic pain client, but if we're not trying to be too quick, we can expand that window of tolerance, and then they can tremor for longer and really restore their overall nervous system health eventually. So that's the current way that I work with chronic pain the most.
It's very cool because this way of teaching to notice these smaller things increase awareness tremendously.
Right.
You become aware of other things than just what's screaming at you all the time, the pain. So that's very nice. I like it.
Yeah, it's really, well, and I like working with chronic pain because the results are so satisfying. Human suffering there's lots of forms of suffering: pain, depression, anxiety, fear, the lack of the ability to connect to human beings, the lack of the ability to connect to our inner world or our emotional experience. So there's lots of ways that we could be not getting the most out of our human experience. And I have empathy for all those different ways. But with pain, like when somebody's going from most of their mental bandwidth is about managing their pain, and then that starts to recede or become more intermittent and way less of their dominating their day-to-day experience, then they're freed up to do so many other things, start to come into their world. And so watching that transition is like, I always know, okay, wow, I love the work that I'm in when I get to see those kinds of transformations take place.
That's the transformation is the most beautiful thing that happens.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. So how do you incorporate tremoring and Feldenkrais?
Yes, I was hoping you were going to ask that question. We're in sync as we so often are. Yeah, so I'll just give the quick background version of how I got into Feldenkrais. So originally, after spending a number of years following the structural integration as one of my main offerings. I was already doing TRE and somatic experiencing, but I was very often working following the 10-session series of structural integration. I love that framework. I love that work. And the developer of that is a woman named Ida Rolf, who was a German-American woman, a biophysicist or something like that. Anyway, developed sort of theories of fascia and then structural integration a lot before everybody else did, or at least in the Western world. In any case, so she called her work structural integration because her view was that by working with the mechanical relationships fascially, her whole sort of framework was, how can we be better organized structurally within the field of gravity? And her idea actually bordered on her idea was that as we become more in alignment with the field of gravity, we're going to get better health outcomes, but we're also going to get much more positive psycho-emotional growth. So the growth of ourselves as a human being is going to be facilitated by being structurally in positive relationship. And then there's even, you could even take this a step further into more of a almost mystical or spiritual direction, that this idea of harmonizing with the field of gravity via your structural relationship is a way to be maximally integrated with the universe, because the gravitational field being our predominant interrelationship between our physical self and the physical universe. Anyway, I love that framework. I love it a lot. And a friend of hers was this guy, Moshe Feldenkrais, who is an Israeli scientist. And he's the guy who developed the Feldenkrais method. And they had a lot in common, quite a bit of differences, but the in commonness was that they both believed that their methods were about creating more wholeness or integration or integrity within the human being. And both of them believed that their work benefited people both physically, but very much also psychologically, psycho-emotionally, psycho-spiritually, and in terms of functioning, just functioning. Feldenkrais has a term that I like of biological fitness, the idea that we can be biologically fit comes in through his work. So anyway, but his approach was very different. It was not through manipulating the fascia directly, but by really studying movement patterns. So really learning to sense and feel our bones, our connective tissue. And then instead of doing like in traditional exercise, we're doing faster movements, bigger movements. And he loved all of that. His idea was that learning can happen across many dimensions, but that a really good way to learn is to really break things down into a very low stimulus. So a lot of the work, not all of it, but a lot of Feldenkrais work is done laying down, and after a period of really relaxing and settling. And the idea is that we can, by reducing stimulation, slowing down in our nervous system, and then beginning to explore movement patterns, whether that's rolling the neck or moving the eyes, working with the breath in different ways. Because we have first slowed down, then any little changes that we're working with are going to be magnified in our awareness. Or even say you're laying down and you're working with the movement of your finger or something. So if you first spent some time really settling the system, and now you start to play with the independent movement of your different fingers, because your brain has recalibrated, and now what normally, if I'm in the middle of walking down the street and I'm moving my finger, I'm not getting a lot of information from that. But because I've really reduced all the external sort of stimuli, quieted the overall system, now there's much more meaning to that sensation if I'm paying attention to it at the brain level. So his idea was that we can create environments where our nervous system, our brain is most able to increase its sensory ability, and then also increase its ability to change motor patterns if we're in that sort of quieter state with reduced stimuli. So anyway, so he developed all this work, and there's movement, there's rolling on the floor. You go through developmental sequences where you repeat all the stages of being a baby, everything from the sucking reflex. That's one of the first lessons, is doing movements like the suckling reflex is one of the first ones that comes online for a newborn, to laying on your stomach and raising the head and reaching for a toy. And so a lot of the work actually follows a lot of developmental sequencing. But then, of course, he was a judo guy, martial artist. So there's lessons that are much more dynamic, that are about walking, that are about rolling on the floor, all kinds of things. Things like getting up and down from a chair, studying that. You can do a whole lesson on how you sit down and how you get up from a chair. And the benefit of all of this is that, for me anyway, is that you learn to pay attention to how you organize for actions at a much different level. You're just much more aware of how everything interrelates, how your breathing interrelates to the speed of the movement. If I move my right arm here, what happens to my left shoulder? Before I'd studied my bodily awareness, I would maybe say I was doing something with my right arm. I pay attention there, and I don't pay attention to other things. But through Feldenkrais work, you're expanding your sensory awareness. So if I'm moving this arm here, does my weight shift a little bit into this side? So you're learning to notice these things and create more sort of integration. Again, coming back to that word of integration through the body. So anyway, Ida Rolf and Moshe Feldenkrais, very different ways of working, but they noticed that there was a similarity in terms of what the goals were. So coming back to my personal practice, I loved working with structural integration. And when I registered for the Feldenkrais training, I told my first teacher, Jeff Haller, he asked me, why are you doing this? And I said, I feel that with structural integration, I've gotten pretty good at, in a sense, differentiating myofascially and taking a body apart in a way, like separating things that are connected. But I'm not as good as I want to be at putting things back together in an organized whole. And I thought to myself that the Feldenkrais method of teaching people how to become aware of movements and patterns, that this would be a natural extension. So again, if I can really help strip away myofascial patterning that's habitual and not helping, one way that I can keep people moving on their journey towards optimal well-being is to now give them tools of self-awareness and movement and practices that are going to facilitate that somatic organization. So that was the original inspiration, and that was a very good reason to start the training. And then it's a long training. It's 4 years or something like that. And COVID came in there, so that disrupted things a bit. But what's funny to me is that how I actually am using Feldenkrais, mostly now that I'm complete with it, is less in terms of its intersection with structural integration, although I still think it's very useful there. But where I'm really going with Feldenkrais work is the connection between Feldenkrais work and Tremoring, TRE and neurogenic Tremoring.
Yeah.
So where I've really gravitated towards is that connection, because since COVID has gone on, I have taught, in addition to my one-on-one work, I've done a lot of group classes and TRE. And for a few years, I just was always doing the TRE format, warming things. And people were becoming very experienced because there were people who came every week or several times per week and tremored on their own. And
So TRE format, meaning the
I mean,
exercises and the...
the TRE format is sort of the 6 exercise progression. That's the standardized way that we introduce TRE to people.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, those exercises became a bit boring because none of us were beginners anymore.
Yeah.
And so what I began to, and I was going through the Feldenkrais training, and so what I started to do is say, I'm sick of doing the 6 exercises. Let's do a Feldenkrais warm-up. So we'll lay on the ground and we'll roll the pelvis or do different things along the segments of the spine.
This was your laboratory group.
Laboratory group. Became I ended up calling it the Neurogenic Integration Lab or the Neurogenic Tremoring Lab or something. Anyway, because I wanted an opportunity to just explore, and then people really liked it. And then what I was learning was that if we use the strategies and tools of what that Feldenkrais is so good at, really bringing curiosity to the embodied self first, waking up interoception and proprioception at a very detailed level, studying the relationships that we don't normally, when I roll my head, what's happening in the tension in my lower belly. As we start to make these connections that we wouldn't normally think about, if we do these things first and then now we go into, say, 15, 20 minutes of tremoring, what people were reporting was that by having really woken things up first, totally new things were happening in their tremoring. New movements were happening, structural patterns were shifting. And so it was, in a sense, it was really speeding up the progression of the neurogenic tremoring. And so then I began to then, in my one-on-one client work, a lot of which is online, and again, here I am originally as a body worker, and then with COVID and a lot of online stuff, obviously I'm not going to be using my hands at this stage. But fortunately, I was really lucky that I had moved in this Feldenkrais direction because I had a totally different way of getting people, waking up people's inner awareness, and not just in broad ways the way we might do with yoga nidra or something, but in really specific anatomical ways. And once we can wake up that really specific anatomical awareness, first, it's relaxing to do that, which is good from a self-regulation perspective with TRE. But more than that, their nervous system is a much more available learning state for something new to happen. And the way I've been languaging it is that, to me, like Feldenkrais work, there's other styles that are similar, Hana somatics, and then Eastern traditions as well, Qigong and Tai Chi. So but these frameworks, and for me, it's Feldenkrais. Feldenkrais is a way to become really nuanced about the voluntary movement system. What's happening as I pay attention and I start to refine my ability to move and act and breathe within my voluntary nervous system, which is good. A lot of our lives are under voluntary control, and we want to be able to refine those things. We're going to be a more effective human being when we are more refined in our voluntary nervous system. And what I think TRE and neurogenic tremoring excels at is what happens when we let go of our voluntary nervous system. It turns out there's this massive involuntary movement system that wants to do things, so that if we stimulate the neurogenic tremor reflex and in a sense we get out of the way, our body starts to show us all of these things that it's wanting to do to unwind tension patterns, to dissipate zones of tension, to bring awareness into areas that have been shut off due to stress or trauma, incomplete motor responses associated with events, injuries, emotional completion whether that's anger, grief, etc., that hasn't been expressed, that when we tap into the involuntary nervous system, suddenly all this movement wants to come forward. So what I'm really playing with these days is that both slices of our life are really important. Our ability to act under conscious control in ways that are organized and effective, and that we know about the dynamic quality of our autonomic nervous system, and we can trust that sometimes things emerge from us that are self-regulatory, that are important to come back to a full sense of reset, body and mind, and that if we can, in a sense, become, as individuals, if we can really study both sides of that, in my view, can really help progress us at that level of integration. And then you and I spoke about that's sort of part of the reason that you and I came to the neurogenic integration as our company name and the website and the kind of what we're exploring through the podcast and through the courses is we're looking at how does tremoring as a key part of integration, how does that relate to other kinds of integration through breath as a main area of interest, Feldenkrais as I'm describing, Bodywork as a focus for integration, as well as other ones. So that's a little bit about how those two things came together.
Would you say, from what I'm hearing, from what I'm understanding, is that somatic experience in the beginning phase, when you're using tremoring as a process of discovery,
Right.
would you also find it useful on the other end when the discovery phase of course, that will be on an ongoing basis because new layers appear naturally. But as you move that patient over towards more Feldenkrais in order to rebuild again, would you use the tremoring in that phase as well? In terms of finding new patterns, new discoveries, that the body could find new solutions on in its own.
Totally.
Yeah.
I really like that question because what it makes me think about is, in a way, like, all right, so many of my clients are where we begin is something is not going all that well. There's discomfort, could be physical, could be, again, anxiety, emotional discomfort, relational discomfort. So there's something that almost everybody who's coming to me or this sort of work, there's in a sense, a problem that they're trying to solve.
Mm.
And so oftentimes the first phase of my work with somebody is trying to understand what that problem is and then looking for body mind strategies to change it. And so tremoring in the early phase is often about downshifting the nervous system, accessing and releasing emotional content or even just raw physiological content like
Mm.
implicit memory, moving out of habitual freeze immobilization.
Mm.
That's a huge part of my
Yeah,
work is
okay.
I call it thawing. So the going through a thawing experience is common with probably anybody who's a long-term person with me, probably at least 70% of my clients are going to go through some version of a thawing experience where they're resolving freeze immobilization that they may not have even have known about, but it
Yeah, exactly.
emerges when we dive into the nervous system.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's like phase one is down-regulating the bad stuff and then starting to bring, and so it's kind of going from bad, something's wrong, coming back towards like neutrality. That's like phase one.
Mm.
And that's really good. It's really good to release the symptoms, right? To get back to neutrality. But then in some ways, I don't want to stop there and just get new patients. I like to go further than that and move more into the expansion phase,
Yeah.
expanding into their lives. It might be about their relationship with themselves. For some people, it's more of they're developing a deeper, it might be even a spiritual sort of direction that they're moving, expanding into. Other people, it's about how they are in relationship with others. Others, it's about movements that are now available to them because they're no longer restricted by pain or lack of energy, and
Exactly.
because their window of tolerance has grown, they can take more on. And so in that phase, it's like the re-expanding into themselves or into the world phase. Now, totally still using tremoring, but it's different. It's not about releasing old patterns and things like that. It's about discovering new
Yes,
patterns,
exactly.
bringing physiological vitality into more layers of the person,
Yes.
bringing movement, flexibility of movement more throughout the person's structure. So I really see tremoring as really supporting that expansion
Mm.
phase. And in some ways, that's my favorite part. A lot of
Yeah.
joy comes in there, creativity, meaning, insights. A lot of that stuff builds during that
Yeah.
phase of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.